My name is Coja Yamashita. I'm the Fish Health Unit Leader for the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. And today we're going to be talking about gill lice, what gill lice are, why they're a concern in Pennsylvania, why they're a concern in the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, and then also we're going to be talking about some of the strategies that the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission has taken to address these concerns. So, as far as gill lice, they are a member of the genus Samicola. They are a parasitic copepod. These parasitic copepods primarily attach to the gills of fish. Sometimes they attach to fin insertions, or just other places on the body as well. The genus Samicola is not new. It's been around for a long time. People have known about it for a long time. First recorded by Linnaeus in 1761. As far as the species that we're concerned about, they've been recorded in Wisconsin, Michigan, New York from the early 1900s. So they have been around, and they've been primarily associated with aquaculture throughout this in the early detections. As far as in Pennsylvania, we've known they've been in Pennsylvania since the mid-1980s. We had reports of them in commercial hatcheries. We also had some reports from anglers starting in the mid-1980s. So they've been around for a while. However, in 2016, we started to get an increase in angler reports. We also started seeing our first incidences of gill lice on wild brook trout in the inland waters of Pennsylvania, so waters that weren't associated with Lake Erie. As far as the genus Samicola, there's 12 species in North America. In Pennsylvania, we're really only concerned about 2 of them. And the real interesting thing about gill lice are they're very host specific, meaning they attach to a certain family of fish normally. The 2 that we deal with in Pennsylvania, one of them is Samicola edwardsii. It's primarily attaches to brook trout in Pennsylvania. They attach to brook trout, lake trout, basically the char family, Arctic char, and that's all they attach to. The other one is Samicola californiensis, and they primarily attach to rainbow trout. As the name implies, californiensis, they're from the west coast, just like rainbow trout, and were imported along with rainbow trout to our part of the country. As far as the host requirements or the pathogen requirements, like I said, they're very host specific. So wherever you find brook trout, those are the same requirements that the parasite needs. And the same thing with the rainbow trout. Another thing about them, the increase in temperature can decrease the amount of time it takes for them to go through development. So within that temperature range that they survive in, at the higher levels of that temperature range, they're actually going to start reproducing faster, and you'll get more of them. This is also where the host fish, we're primarily going to be talking about brook trout and edwardsii. So at the higher temperatures, they're stressed. These things are also reproducing faster at that point in time. And it's also important to note that they have not been directly linked to mortality. They're there, they stress the fish out, and like I said before, they're primarily been associated with aquaculture. And I don't know if you guys can see the pointer, but the bottom picture over here, a lot of the people that are in aquaculture don't want to sell fish with parasites on the gills like that. So primarily in the past, that was the focus, was we want to have a fish that we can sell, and it's just all aesthetic. However, they have been linked to a decrease in respiration, and they also have been shown that fish that are infected are also more susceptible to temperature increase. So you'll see more mortality at higher temperatures if the fish have gill lice. And like I said before, it's primarily used to be considered just an aesthetic issue in aquaculture. So as far as the life cycle, from egg to gravid female, it takes anywhere from 28 to 32 days depending on temperature. It's a direct life cycle. A lot of parasites and pathogens in fish involve multiple hosts. Gill lice is just one. It goes straight from the juveniles, which is kind of pictured down here on the bottom, up to the adult by attaching to a single host. So they'll start off as a juvenile. They're a free-living parasite at this point in time. They're copepods, so you kind of think of them as a crustacean. As you can see, the juvenile down here on the bottom right, they have their segmented body. They look kind of like a little crab or some kind of crustacean that you normally expect to see. And they live in the bottom in the sediment. When a fish swims over, they'll swim up and attach to the fish. If it's the right species of fish, they'll start their life cycle. If not, they end up dying. And after they attach, they metamorphosize, and basically they turn into a kind of looks more like a blob of jelly or something. They lose their segmentation, and they're basically just there trying to reproduce. The male, after it fertilizes the female on the fish, it'll die. Females remain there. They can have 2 clutches of eggs, approximately 100 eggs per clutch. And so you can figure each female can produce about 200 eggs. It's kind of interesting if you think of like a life cycle of, let's say, a butterfly. It kind of goes in reverse. The butterfly, they start off with the larva form and they develop into something that's more with segmented wings and becomes more intricate. Gill lice are kind of the opposite. They start off with this organism that's got all kinds of segments, and they look like a little crab, and they develop into what looks mostly like a larva at the end of their life cycle. And another thing to keep in mind is that males and juveniles are microscopic, very hard to see with the naked eye. A lot of times when you see gill lice with the naked eye, really what you're seeing is the egg sacs that are hanging off of the gravid females. So, like I said, we knew that gill lice were in Pennsylvania since the mid-1980s. It had been reported. It wasn't really that much of a concern because all the literature and everything that we were reading says it's just something that commercial hatcheries are worried about. The fish, they don't like the way the fish look. However, in 2016, when we started finding some in the wild, we started getting this. All of a sudden it just showed up, the newspapers were carrying it, and also it was a really big deal. And the main reason for that was some research that was going on in Wisconsin. There were some biologists in Wisconsin that had been doing a long-term study on brook trout populations out there in specific streams. And what they started noticing was that in certain streams, the brook trout populations were declining rapidly. And they're trying to figure out, well, why is this happening? They've been studying these streams for over a decade in some cases. What they noticed is that the stream had an increasing population of brown trout. So as the brook trout would die off, brown trout would take their place as added stressor. But more significantly, they noticed that in a lot of these streams, they had an increase in gill lice or introduction of gill lice to these streams at the same time. In addition to that, the average temperature had been increasing in Wisconsin. So they put this all together. The brown trout had been in these streams for a long time. Temperature was increasing in other streams nearby. The only thing that was really different was some of these streams had gill lice in them. So at the end of their research, they published a paper, and basically what they said was that species interactions between brook trout, brown trout, and gill lice in the context of changing environmental conditions may lead to declines in brook trout recruitment. So there would be no younger fish moving up through the system, and eventually this would lead to the local expiration of fish in those streams. So you'd stop seeing brook trout in these specific streams. And so they started coming in late 2015, 16, they were publishing this paper, they were going to conferences, talking to biologists about this. And at the same time, Trout Unlimited in Wisconsin was reaching out to the anglers about this. And everybody knows Trout Unlimited has a very large social network. And through that social network, through the anglers were reaching out to anglers around the country saying this is a problem. At the same time, the biologists were reaching out. So with the combination of that, it was really, everybody was aware of gill lice at that point in time, or a lot of people, so that when they showed up in Pennsylvania, we started seeing the articles in the paper and everybody was concerned about it. Prior to that, nobody really seemed, it wasn't that big of a deal. But now that when we started looking at this at a population level and the effect that gill lice were having on a population, not just what was happening in a hatchery or something like that, it really started causing a lot more concern. So we started looking at, well, where are we finding gill lice in Pennsylvania? I said before, there's 2 species that we're concerned with in Pennsylvania, Edwardsia and Californiensis. So as of December 2018, these are where we found gill lice in Pennsylvania. There's 46 streams that we found Edwardsia in, and there's 6 streams or locations where we found Californiensis. The one I want to mention is the red dot up in the top left in Lake Erie. That's not a specific location. That is a reference to all the Great Lakes. The steelhead in the Great Lakes, the Pacific salmon in some of the other states, they all have gill lice. They were imported from the western United States at some point in time, probably came in with the fish that were imported. So that has been known that the Californiensis has been in the Great Lakes for a while. These detections down here were new to the Fish and Boat Commission as we started looking into this. And we brought this to the attention of people. A lot of people said, well, you're just not looking hard enough. You're just finding wherever you look. If you started looking more places, you'd probably find them more places. And one of the things that we did was, well, we have a large crew out there. We have a lot of collaborators that are out there looking, doing population analysis, surveys, and other streams. And we have been looking. So this slide here shows all the locations that we've looked that have had wild brook trout. There have been almost 1,400 streams or locations we've looked that have had wild brook trout since 2016. We've only found it in 46. We've had 240 places with wild rainbows, and hatchery rainbows. We've only found it in 6. So it's not everywhere. That's something that we were able to establish, that this parasite is pretty localized. And you can see there's a grouping right there in the middle, north central part of the state where we're really seeing an issue. So that's some of the research we've been able to do is really document that it's not everywhere. It does seem to be in certain locations. And we also want to see, well, what effect is it actually having on these locations where we find it? So this is some more data that we collected. This is surveys from 2016 to 2018. So some of these streams where we thought that the parasite had recently been introduced, we went back in, we thought this happened in 2016, we went back in 2018 and did another survey of the stream. And this is the number of trout per hectare. And as you can see, in some cases, the population of brook trout in those streams went up. But there were several where it went down pretty significantly. This one right here, Gump Stump Run, the first time we surveyed it in 2016, there was 380 brook trout we got out of that section. Went back in 2018, there was 0. Yeah, so, and this is similar to what they were finding in Wisconsin. It wasn't consistent that everywhere there was gill lice, there was a population decline in brook trout, but it was happening in certain locations. So this is really it's very similar to what they're seeing in Wisconsin. And the Fish and Boat Commission, we looked at this data and said, this is very concerning. We want to protect the wild resource with wild brook trout. Another reason it was concerning was if you look at where brook trout are located in Pennsylvania. This map depicts the best populations to the strongholds of brook trout. And the green colors here, that's where the best populations of brook trout are. I think everybody probably knows that the wild brook trout in Pennsylvania, due to habitat, changing environment, the populations are decreasing across the state. And we want to do everything we can as an agency, as a conservation agency, to protect those brook trout that remain and really protect those areas. And if you remember where we saw a lot of those blue dots, it's right there where the best populations of brook trout are as well. So we're very concerned about this. So the next part is going to the presentation is really going to talk about what we did as an agency in response to this. And to understand that, you really have to look at what kind of fish health regulations there are currently in Pennsylvania or were in 2016. There is no national requirements requiring that fish from hatcheries be tested for pathogens. Or there are no annual inspections or things like that. In Pennsylvania, the Fish and Boat Commission regulates what can be put into the waters of the Commonwealth. So we can say what species you can put in and where you can put those. We don't have a stocking permit. A stocking permit is something that a lot of other states have, majority of other states have. It's saying if you're going to stock fish, you need to fill out this form, submit it to us, and we're going to tell you it's okay to put those fish, that species, that number, in this location. We don't have that in Pennsylvania. And also included in a lot of those stocking permits is that there is a fish health component saying that if you have a hatchery, you got to have your fish inspected annually, biannually, and you have to look for these specific pathogens. If it's positive, if your hatchery is positive for these pathogens, you can't stock fish. We don't have that in Pennsylvania either. We do have very limited fish health regulations in Pennsylvania, and that's regarding viral hemorrhagic septicemia. It's a virus that's found in Lake Erie. So we have some regulations saying that you cannot move fish out of the Lake Erie drainage without having them tested. But that's pretty much it when it comes to fish health regulations in Pennsylvania. As far as what the Fish and Boat Commission does, we conduct annual fish health inspections at all of our 14 hatcheries. We also conduct fish health inspections at 9 of our cooperative nurseries. I'm going to talk a little bit later about what a cooperative nursery is that are in the Lake Erie Basin. So we self-regulate ourselves. That's primarily what I do. And 90% of the time when I'm at work is doing these hatchery inspections. We're looking for certain pathogens, making sure that we're, as an agency, are not stocking pathogens into the wild or transferring pathogens between our facilities. And we follow the Great Lakes Fish Health Committee protocol. So as an agency, we're self-policing ourselves. However, when it comes to commercial hatcheries, that falls under the Department of Agriculture, and they do not require fish health testing, and there's no testing requirements. This is just going to kind of give a timeline of what we did after starting in 2016 when we realized that this was a problem. So like I said before, gill lice were known to be in Pennsylvania since the mid-1980s. However, in 2016, it marked our first observations by our field staff. And we also found them in our cooperative nurseries, some of our cooperative nurseries. And cooperative nursery is, you kind of think of it as advanced TIC program. Instead of giving the cooperative nursery eggs, we give them fingerlings. These are usually sportsman clubs, all volunteer. They have raceways at these locations. They put the fish in the raceways, they raise them to adults, and then they stock them for the anglers of Pennsylvania. So we started finding some gill lice in some of these cooperative nurseries. Given the information that was coming out of Wisconsin at that point in time, we had a self-imposed zero, we decided to go with the self-imposed zero tolerance for stocking infected fish with gill lice. That's from our state hatcheries, that's from our cooperative nurseries. Starting in 2016, we said we will not be stocking gill lice. We're a conservation agency. This is not, this doesn't follow our policies, a resource first policy. We got to limit the negative effects of stocking on wild brook trout. So we're not going to stock any fish that are positive from gill lice. Since 2016, so from 2016 to 2019, we've found 4 cooperative nurseries that have been positive for gill lice. When we find a gill lice in a cooperative nursery, we go in, we euthanize the positive fish. Since 2016, this has resulted in the euthanization of 50,000 fish about. And what we do when we find gill lice in a hatchery, after we euthanize them, we go in and replace those fish with a less susceptible species. So if we find Edwardsi, they are only susceptible to brook trout. So we'll take all the brook trout out of that system and we'll replace them with rainbows or brown trout. If we find Californiensis, which parasitizes rainbow trout, we'll take all the rainbow trout out of that system and we'll replace them with brook trout or brown trout. If we find both of them, we tell the co-op, you can't have brook trout, you can't have rainbows, you're stuck with brown trout, and we only give them brown trout. So far that seems to be working, it's very effective. We also were able to go back and look at this when we looked at what had happened at those cooperative nurseries. Majority of the time, in the recent past, you'd be able to go back and see that they had purchased fish from a commercial hatchery. We knew they were not coming from our state hatcheries, so we do our inspections at our state hatcheries. We hadn't found them, so we concluded that a lot of this was coming from commercial hatcheries that gave fish that were commercial fish that were purchased by these cooperative nurseries. We also reached out to different sportsman organizations, more specifically Trout Unlimited, similar to what they did in Wisconsin. Said, hey, can you guys reach out to your anglers? If anybody sees gill lice, can you report that to us? And this actually helped. Some of those dots that were on the previous slides came from Trout Unlimited members, reporting this to us. Other times it was just anglers on their own reporting it as well. We also altered our stockings. We said, if you look at the way the parasite works, if we know that a stream is positive for Edwardsi, and we put a bunch of brook trout in that stream, now we're increasing the number of hosts in that system. It's going to eventually lead to an increase in the prevalence of the parasite. So we said we're going to stop doing that. So we started altering our stocking practices. If the water is positive for Edwardsi, we don't put brook trout in it anymore. If the water is positive for Californiensis, we don't stock it with rainbow trout. So that's all. This is all things that we did in 2016 when it first realized that there was an issue. 2017, we reached out through the Department of Agriculture to the commercial hatcheries. We encouraged them to work towards monitoring and eradicating gill lice from their systems. We don't have control over them, so we basically tried to ask nicely, hey, can you guys please look into this? We also did a lot of monitoring in 2017. 2018, you remember we were able to go back and actually see what kind of effect these gill lice were having on some of these streams. And then once we saw that it is having a negative effect on some streams, we took an approach to look, what can we do? We just still don't have a stocking permit, but there has to be something we can do. So we looked at what kind of regulatory items we have in place right now. One thing that the Fish and Boat Commission does is that we have what's called a special activities permit. And what that says is that if you are having a fishing tournament or if you're having a fishing derby, you have to apply for a special activities permit. And we review that and we check off, say, okay, you're good to go, or we don't like the way this is going. So we put language into that permit. If you're going to have a fishing derby and you're going to be purchasing fish, you have to make sure that they are certified gill lice free. And this happened in the spring of 2018, we put this in place. In response to that, we also had to develop a protocol and a certificate. There was no protocol out there to certify gill lice, facility as being gill lice free, so we had to develop a protocol. We also had to train individuals to go out and do the certification. So we developed a training program for veterinarians, and this was done in collaboration with the Fish and Boat Commission and the University of Pennsylvania. So we've had 2 classes so far. Now we have about 15 individuals that went through the class that are trained to go out to commercial hatcheries if the commercial hatchery would like, and they actually go out and certify these facilities. To date, we have a little over 20 commercial trout farms that have been certified gill lice free. So this process is working. And then we also do the same protocol at all of our 14 state hatcheries. In addition to that, we have approximately 164 cooperative nurseries. Our staff goes out and does the exact same protocol at all 164 cooperative nurseries annually. These inspections take place every year to ensure that we're not stocking fish with gill lice out of our hatcheries and our cooperative nurseries. In addition to that, in 2018, we formed a fish health work group to discuss actions moving forward. This involved the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. We invited commercial trout farmers that are involved, APHIS to the federal government. We also have a representative there from Trout Unlimited. And we get together about every 3 months and discuss how this process is going and what we can do to improve it. 2019. In addition to the special activities permit, we also require a permit if you're having a pay lake. So if you were have a lot of private facilities have lakes that you pay to go in and fish, you have to have a permit that's signed off on by the Fish and Boat Commission. We put similar language into that as the special activities permit, stating that if you're going to have a pay lake, you're purchasing fish for it, they have to be certified gill lice free. In addition to that, the Fish and Boat Commission has started the process of reducing the number of brook trout stocked in the Commonwealth waters by the Fish and Boat Commission. The state hatcheries, as of 2020, we're going to be looking at about 19% reduction in brook trout, about a 33% reduction from our cooperative nurseries. And then also part of that is changing the TSC species from brook trout to rainbow trout. So this is all part of an ongoing process where we're trying to protect the wild brook trout populations in Pennsylvania by reducing the amount of brook trout that we're putting in here. We're not reducing the number of trout and reducing the number of angling opportunities. It's just the number of brook trout. We're changing the composition from, in most cases, from brook trout to rainbow trout. And also in 2019, we're continuing to assess the extent and impact of gill lice issue in the wild. So we're still doing our surveys. We're continuing to monitor for gill lice. We just recently put in for some grants to get extra funding to do some more research. We're assessing populations, and overall, part of that research we want to do is assess the populations of brook trout and the overall fish health in the streams with gill lice and compare that to streams without gill lice and see what effect they're having overall on the population. We also want to look at the genetic diversity between gill lice populations and also see if they're affecting the genetic diversity of the trout populations in those streams as well. And we're doing this in Pennsylvania as the plan, but we're also working with lots of other conservation agencies from Wisconsin, Colorado, North Carolina, working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, University of Auburn, Indiana University has been helping. So there's a lot of hands in this as we're moving forward to do research and hopefully do some more long-term studies to really be able to assess the impact. So real quickly, why do we want to reduce the brook trout stockings? The main reason in terms of gill lice is Edwardsia needs to reproduce. And when you stock in a water with brook trout, you're going to artificially increase the number of brook trout or number of hosts in that water body. It increases the chance that those juveniles on the bottom of the stream are going to be able to swim up and attach to a brook trout, reproduce, and create more. And basically we're going to be increasing the prevalence of the pathogens in the environment. And they say, well, what if we just stock waters that don't have gill lice? And one of the things we found with brook trout is they do move, and stock trout in general move. Just because you put them somewhere doesn't mean they're going to stay there. Some of our residency study work that was conducted by the Fish and Boat Commission showed that brook trout moved up to 11.6 miles. A study in North Carolina showed that 6% of the fish moved up to 10 kilometers. So these fish move when you put them in. Just because we put them somewhere doesn't mean they're going to stay there. Wild trout also move. There's been several studies that show that. And so the fear is by increasing this prevalence of brook trout, these stock trout can move into areas where wild brook trout are, whether or not they're acting as a vector or they're just moving there and competing for resources. By reducing the amount of brook trout that we're putting into the Commonwealth waters, we're going to reduce the influence they have, the negative influence they can have on the wild brook trout populations. And really at the end of this, it's all about protecting wild brook trout and protecting the resource is what we're doing. We're implementing this strategy, and like I said, it's just the beginning of it in 2019. So this is the end of my presentation. I always like to show a picture of my daughter, but this one has an interesting story about gill lice in this picture. 2018, there's a small stream by our house. We decided we were going to go fishing there. And in the past, we've gone there and we've done pretty good catching a lot of brook trout. We started fishing there. We caught a bunch of brook trout, or not a bunch, we caught a couple brook trout. We started catching some brown trout. And then we caught a brook trout, this brook trout up here. And so this little white blob right there, that's actually gill lice attached to that brook trout. And they're not always on the gills, but it was attached there. And so we scraped it off and talked to her about it. And then we moved about 20, 30 yards upstream. There's a nice hole. And first catch, she caught a 14, 15-inch brown trout out of that hole. This is a small stream, you can pretty much jump across it. She was really excited she caught that fish, and then I had to sit there and explain to her, basically this is the Wisconsin story. This is what's happening. You get gill lice in a brook trout stream. These brook trout start decreasing. Brown trout move in. Really, that stream, I wouldn't expect to catch a lot of big brown trout, but they were in there that day. So it was a learning experience for her. And now when we go fishing, we're not just going fishing. A lot of times it's, hey, Dad, can we go looking for parasites? That's the end of my presentation.